Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Annette Stanton, and I have the honor of chairing the Department of Psychology at UCLA. I want to mention that this event is being recorded, and unfortunately, due to the large number of attendees, we won't be able to take your questions in real time, so the chat and the Q&A functions are turned off. I want to thank you all who gave us questions in advance, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I want to tell you a bit about our department. As many of you know, we're a leading department of psychological science and education in the nation and the world. We have foremost experts in psychology and neuroscience who conduct innovative and impactful research in behavioral neuroscience, cognitive, clinical, developmental health, quantitative, and social psychology. As of this fall, more than 4,000 undergraduates are enrolled in our 3 psychology majors, and our highly competitive Ph.D. program with its 211 graduate students supports tomorrow's leaders in psychological science, teaching, and public service. We also serve the community. In addition to translating our research findings into action to enhance the public's health, UCLA Psychology operates a psychology clinic that provides low-fee therapy and assessment services to adults, children, couples, and families. And we have an infant development program which provides high-quality childcare to infants and toddlers of faculty, staff, and students. One of my favorite activities as chair of the department is highlighting the exciting research and education conducted by our psychology faculty, along with graduate and undergraduate students and postdoctoral scholars. Today, we're all here for the 5th event in our Psychology Presents series, The Science of Relationships, How We Connect and Why It Matters. Relationships are so vital to our health and well-being that in an American Psychologist article, Dr. Ted Robles on our faculty, along with colleagues, made the case that enhancing social connections should be a national public health priority. Our hope is that today's event not only is enlightening for you, but sparks conversation and action. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce the first of our 3 psychology faculty members who will be speaking with us this evening. Our first speaker is Dr. Benjamin Karney. Dr. Karney is professor of psychology and chair of the social psychology area in the department. He earned his Bachelor of Science from Harvard, followed by a doctorate in social psychology, yes, from UCLA. Dr. Karney is co-author of an undergraduate textbook and video series on intimate relationships used by relationship experts around the world. He also co-authored a book for the public based on research with more than 1,000 couples. Love Me Slender offers a fresh approach to weight loss that turns partners from diet saboteurs into health allies. As co-director with our own Dr. Tom Bradbury of the UCLA Marriage and Close Relationships Lab, Dr. Karney and his team have conducted a number of studies to help explain how marriages change and how couples can keep their relationships strong. I'll let him tell you more about his research. Welcome, Professor Karney.
Thank you so much, Annette. And thanks to all of the people who are taking time out of their week to listen to us and to share ideas with us. As Annette said, I am a relationship scientist. I've trained as a social psychologist right here, but I consider myself a relationship scientist. And in particular, I study intimate relationships, intimate or romantic relationships. And I've been studying them for over 30 years now. And the question that I ask is really one basic question, and it's kind of an enduring question. What happens to love over the course of an intimate relationship? Now, that's an interesting question because when a relationship begins, when people fall in love, they are feeling the most intoxicating emotion that a human being can feel. When you ask them, and we've done this, we've asked couples who've just fallen in love, what do you want from the future? And they all want one thing: to stay in love, to feel this for a long, long time. And that's especially poignant for couples that get married, because when couples get married, they actually announce this intention to all of the most important people in their lives, often within either a legal institution or a religious institution. And they say, I declare my commitment to love this person forever, for the rest of my life, till death do us part. Now, we all know that people don't change their minds that often about a lot of things. If you're discussing an issue, controversial issue of the day, people don't change their minds. But they don't change their minds about almost anything, but they do change their minds about their marriage. Lots of people, despite the wedding, despite their public declaration, end up changing their minds. And many marriages end in divorce. About 40% or so end in divorce, but more than that also end in permanent separation. And more than that, although they stay together, are not anymore in love. So there's a real mystery, which is, where does that feeling go that nobody wants to let go of? That's the question that we've examined in our lab. And again, I'm interested in intimacy broadly, but marriage is a pretty good place to study it because most people in the United States still get married. The vast majority of people in the United States, nearly 90%, will get married in their lifetime. And most people express a positive feeling towards preserving those marriages. What happens to those marriages? And what has happened over history? Let me show you some data. I didn't gather this data. This is demographic, this is census data. But what's happened to marriage and divorce over the last 150 years or so in the United States? Let me show you this slide. I think you can see it. So this is historical data that shows that marriage and divorce rates in the United States have changed a lot over the last nearly 150 years. And that's interesting because if we want to understand what causes divorce, these data force us to ask some hard questions about conventional wisdom. So for example, if conventional wisdom says, you know what makes a good marriage? Commitment, caring about your marriage. People who stay married are the people who really decide that they're going to make a commitment. Well, if that's true, then to understand what's going on, you can see my arrow. This orange line is the line of changes in divorce rates over the last 150 years. You have to somehow argue that people were less committed in 1945 when the divorce rate spiked, more committed in 1960, and then less committed again in the late 70s and early 80s. It's hard to argue that commitment changes that much over time. Well, what's another conventional wisdom? Another conventional wisdom might be people get divorced because they don't know how to communicate well. They have to learn how to communicate better. But if that's true, we'd have to somehow argue that divorce rates were high in 1945, people weren't communicating well. Then they started communicating really well in 1960, and then in 1980, they stopped communicating well. That doesn't seem to make any sense either. So when we look at these data, how can we understand changes in divorce over historical periods? And one answer to that is what has changed that maps pretty well onto these patterns is economic conditions in the United States. So as this figure points out, World War II ended and marriages and divorces both spiked because suddenly a lot of people came home from the war. The 1950s and 60s were a period of tremendous economic growth in the United States and marriages were relatively stable. In the late 1960s to the 1980s, witnessed the diminishment and decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States. Suddenly, in 1960, a high school graduate could support a family of 4. That was no longer true in 1980. So this kind of data suggests that what makes a healthy relationship in this country isn't only what two people do. It's also what happens outside of those people, what happens in the country in which those two people reside. And there's lots of evidence that this is true. I can show you another slide. That socioeconomic status, which is very highly associated with education, people who graduate from college tend to be of higher socioeconomic status than people who don't graduate from college. Turns out that divorce rates vary a lot depending on whether you went to college or didn't go to college. If we completed college or didn't go to complete college, take a look at this figure. This light blue line is college graduates. Over the last 10 years, college graduates have had a stable divorce rate, and it's half the divorce rate of people who didn't complete college. So in this country, the outcome of marriage, which is something so intimate and private, has to do with economic conditions, which leads us to ask the question that my lab has been asking for the last 15 years or so. How do economic contexts affect intimacy? How does something that goes on outside the house affect our private moments inside the house? And the first question we asked is, well, what's the difference between people who are sort of more affluent or less affluent? And the first question we ask I'll ask you. We ask, is it values? Is it that people who are poor don't care about marriage? Did a large survey of the country and found that everybody cares about marriage. Doesn't matter how wealthy or not wealthy you are. So then we said, well, is it behavior? Is it somehow something about the way they behave? So we did a study where we recruited lower income and higher income newlyweds based on their marriage licenses, visited them in their homes, and videotaped the couple talking about problems in the marriage. Now, these were all newlyweds. You'd think they would all be lovey-dovey and cuddly, but they were not. Take it from me. There's even among newlyweds, a really wide range of behavior that you observe when you videotape couples talking about, personal issues with each other. What predicted couples who were behaving well and effectively and affectionately versus couples that were angry or hostile or uncompromising? Well, we compared a lot of variables. We looked at their attitudes, we looked at their family backgrounds, but the best predictor was stress. Couples who were under stress had difficulty talking about their problems compared to couples who were more fortunate, who were more privileged, who were under less stress. And that makes sense. Even marital researchers who are under stress, who really know a lot about how to deal with good communication, can still sometimes behave less than their best selves when they're under stress. Well, that's interesting. So what does that mean? Well, does it mean that we should teach if we want to help poor couples, does it mean we should teach them how to communicate better? Turns out the United States government invested a lot of money in the early 2000s trying that strategy, offering classes to poor couples. It did not work. It had no effect. One of the reasons it had no effect is that couples who were already stressed didn't have time to attend another set of classes. They were already stressed. The class was just another stressor. What are our other options? Another option would be somehow make them less stressed. Can we do something to make them less stressed? And in fact, there is something we can do to make them less stressed, which is pass policies, public policies that help poor people. And one of those policies would be, let's say, raise the minimum wage. Turns out I got together with some economists over at the Rand Corporation down in Santa Monica, and we analyzed, is there a difference in divorce rates between states that do or don't raise the minimum wage? Now, of course, those states differ from each other, but if you control for different pre-existing differences between states, you can sort of tease apart what is the effect of the policy change on divorce rates. Here's what we found. A $1 increase in a state's minimum wage predicts, of course, higher incomes for low-wage earners and declines in marriage entry rates, which is a good thing among young people because the early marriages are associated with higher divorce, and declines in divorce rates, a 12% decline. That's a big difference. So one of the things we're doing now is exploring how can policymakers pass laws that make life easier for families. And it turns out there's lots of ways we can do it. One last point I'll make to you, which is, what if you're not making the minimum wage? What can we do? What can people who don't make minimum wage do to help their relationships be better, given that there are factors outside of our control? And the answer to that is, we can pay attention to those factors, pay attention to stress, give our partners the benefit of the doubt. And that's another thing that when we do it, allows us to say, hey, there's things I can't control, but I can control my perception of my partner, my willingness to forgive my partner, and my awareness that life can be sometimes hard, and that's what makes relationships succeed or fail. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ben. That's fascinating, and it makes me think about the stresses external to my relationship and what we can do about them. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Carolyn Parkinson. Dr. Parkinson is assistant professor of social psychology at UCLA and also a member of the Brain Research Institute. Dr. Parkinson earned her Bachelor's of Science in Psychology at McGill University and her Ph.D. in Cognitive Neuroscience from Dartmouth. At UCLA, Professor Parkinson is the Wendell Jeffrey and Bernice Wenzel Term Endowed Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience, and she directs the Computational Social Neuroscience Lab. Dr. Parkinson received our Life Sciences Division Excellence Award for outstanding research publication for her Nature Communications article, Similar Neural Responses Predict Friendship. Her research has been featured in the New York Times and the Today Show, among other media outlets. Now let's learn about Dr. Parkinson's research. Take it away.
So thank you so much for that really generous introduction. So I guess you've just heard about romantic relationships, and later on you're going to hear about family relationships. And so now I'm going to spend the next few minutes telling you a little bit about friendships, and in particular, the networks of friendships that surround us. And specifically, my lab studies the interaction between our social networks, so primarily friendship networks, and what goes on within our minds as individuals. And for many people, when you hear the phrase social network, you immediately think of online communities. So communities where you might follow people or become virtual friends with them, like Twitter or Facebook. And although sometimes we use data from websites or apps like these to do social networks research, generally this is not all that's meant when we talk about studying social networks and how they relate to how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. So instead, we're usually talking about the kinds of social networks that humans have been making for thousands and thousands of years. So basically, no matter what culture or location or era you're living in, you're going to have some set of people who you connect with, who each have their own set of social connections. And then so we're embedded in these interwoven fabrics of social relationships or these networks. And so we're tied to certain sets of people in these networks in particular ways. And so, as I said, in my lab, we study the interaction between the structure of our social networks and our individual minds and brains. And so we study things like how we understand and learn about and navigate our networks. And also we relate the ways that we process the world around us. So things like how we see the world, the kinds of things that catch our attention and how we emotionally respond to things, to where we sit in our social networks. And I'll give you some specific examples of these sorts of things in a minute. But at first glance, you might think that this combination of topics, so brains on the one hand and social networks on the other, seems a little bit odd or incongruous. So you might be thinking, well, why on earth would we think that we could learn anything about the human brain from studying our social networks, or really vice versa? So to tackle that first question, one reason that you might be interested in social networks, if you're interested in learning about the brain, is that we spend a lot of time using our brains to think about other people and where they sit in our social networks. So one window into the kinds of things that people spend their time thinking about is the kind of things that people spend their time speaking about. And about 2/3 of our everyday conversations appear to revolve around other people and the social interactions and relationships between them. So essentially gossip, things like who's a friend of whom, who's on the outs with whom, and so on. And it's even been argued very prominently that much of what's distinctive about the cognitive capacity of the human brain evolved to support tracking and managing this kind of information so that we can effectively navigate our big, complexly bonded social world. So, for every person that you add to a community, the number of potential relationships for each community member to track increases exponentially. So understanding and monitoring our social networks is a really huge computational challenge for our brains. But we often take our really sophisticated abilities to do this for granted because it really seems so effortless to many of us a lot of the time, because we are so good at it. So being tuned into the relationships that surround us seems to be something that we're sort of wired for. And consistent with this idea, our work shows that our brains are constantly tracking and encoding the structure of our social networks, or the social lay of the land, so to speak. So when we encounter someone who we know, our brains automatically retrieve all of this sort of information about them to help us gear up to think and act in an appropriate and beneficial way. So to study these kinds of things, we tend to take an approach where we get everybody in some bounded community, like a school or a village, and we get every person in that community to tell us who their friends are. And then using that information, we can map out the social network of the community. And then we can have some of those people or all of those people come into the lab for neuroimaging studies and behavioral studies to look at their cognition as individuals and then relate that to their social network data. And so from doing studies like these, we found, for example, that when you just see someone who you know, the patterns of activity that are automatically evoked in your brain tell you all sorts of information about where that person sits in your social network. So things like the degrees of separation between you. So is this person a friend? Are they a friend of a friend? Or are they farther removed from you in social ties? Also things like, Are they a really well-connected social hub, or are they more socially isolated? And do they tend to bridge between different communities, or are they embedded in a tightly knit social clique? And we also see that once all of this social network information is retrieved by the brain, it has all sorts of downstream impacts on how we perceive and interact with each other. So it shapes things like who we pay a lot of attention to, who we empathize with, who we put our trust in, and so on. So we seem to be wired not just to connect with others ourselves, but also to keep track of how other people are connecting to each other. And this shapes how we think, how we feel, and how we act. So this is just one way that integrating social networks into the study of the brain can tell us something about the brain. And it seems to be, the case that part of what our brains are doing when we're just going about the world and encountering other people is tracking and encoding where those people sit in our social networks. So what about that other side of the coin? So what could we possibly learn about our social networks by studying the brain? So it turns out that how our brains respond to the world in general is predictive of where we end up sitting in our social networks. So many of us have the sense that we're friends with other people who are like us, or that birds of a feather flock together, as the saying goes. And you might have this intuition that your friends are not just people who fulfill certain demographic criteria, like same gender, check, same race, check, same age, check. Within certain demographic groups, we of course resonate with some people more than others, and hopefully you have friends who fall into lots of different demographic categories that often differ from your own. But until relatively recently, a lot of research in this vein has focused on pretty coarse variables like demographics. And this is in spite of the sort of perception that a lot of us have that our friends are people who we sort of click with. So people who respond to things like we do and who see the world from a similar perspective. And one window into how we respond to the world, so into our thoughts, our emotions, and how we allocate our attention as these processes unfold, is given by how activity in particular parts of the brain evolves over time, where we're experiencing really complex stimuli that resemble the richness of our everyday real world sensory experiences. So things like film clips, for example, like what you're seeing here. So in some other work, we took a similar approach to what I described earlier, where we mapped out the social networks of communities and had some of those people come in for neuroimaging studies. And we find that friends have particularly similar neural responses to one another, so they're most in sync with one another. And the similarity decreases with social distance. So as we go from friends to friends of friends to people farther removed from one another in social ties. And in some longitudinal research where we follow people over time, we're examining what kinds of similarities predict friendships that haven't happened yet, and what kinds of similarities stem from friends aligning themselves with one another over time. And we're also finding that certain kinds of idiosyncrasies in neural responding relative to other people in one's community are linked with both objective and subjective social disconnection or loneliness. So they can serve as sort of a biomarker of these things. So hopefully what I've shown you in the past few minutes is that we can fruitfully combine these levels of analysis, looking at information processing within individuals and the social networks that people inhabit. And I think this is important because if we really want to understand social thought and behavior and their neural basis, we can't just treat people as isolated units or even just as interacting pairs and expect to be able to tell the complete story. Even when we're just looking at a very simple social interactions, maybe two people bumping into one another in the hallway or having a conversation on the street, what's really going on under the hood, so things like how they're perceiving and reacting to one another and how they're influencing and being influenced by one another, seem to take into account this rich fabric of social ties in which each one of us is embedded. And so with that, I just want to quickly thank you for your time and attention and all the wonderful people involved in the research that I just mentioned. And I'm looking forward to chatting more and answering questions during the rest of the session.
Dr. Parkinson, that was really fascinating. I'm so inspired that you can study both the inner workings of relationships and the brain. It's really fascinating. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Rena Repetti. Dr. Repetti is a professor of clinical and health psychology at UCLA. She earned her BA from Hunter College in New York and her PhD in clinical psychology from Yale. Professor Repetti has received 2 of our department's most prized awards, the Distinguished Teaching Award and the J. Arthur Woodward Award for Excellence in Mentoring at the graduate student level. As you'll see, her research involves intensive observations of participating families as they go about their daily lives in order to illuminate processes involved in communication, stress, and emotion at multiple levels of analysis. I'm sure you want to learn more about these topics, so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Repetti.
Thank you very much, Annette, and I will just share my screen here. Hopefully that's up. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. We are built to be social creatures, and one of the most important ways that we connect is through the medium of emotion. My students and I study how family members' emotions and even their physiology can become intertwined. I'm going to speak today about children's emotions in the context of family relationships, and especially I'm going to focus on the roles of compassion, touch, and social withdrawal. My research strives to, in a sense, put families under the microscope, to observe them in real time in their everyday environments. One example of that is a group called the UCLA Center for the Everyday Lives of Families. This group collected over 1,400 hours of video recordings of families just going about their day-to-day lives. And these recordings have helped us to learn about how family members connect through emotion expression in their ordinary encounters with each other. We've learned that when and how we direct our attention to displays of emotion really matters. One of the ways that we pay attention to another's emotions, of course, is the words that we use. In an analysis of the recordings, we counted commonplace verbal expressions of 4 emotions. So for example, we looked for instances of compassion. That might be a child with a scraped knee and that being met with a concerned, oh, poor thing, or gratitude, a kind gesture receives a thanks. The same for pride and amusement, simple words that convey a sense of connection to others. All 4 emotions were expressed quite regularly in the families that we studied. In fact, the average family expressed positive emotions about 16 times per hour. But that's the average. The families actually differed from each other quite a bit. They ranged from a low of 5 per hour to more than 30 expressions of positive emotion per hour in our most positive family. Those differences matter. It was, in particular, the parents' words of compassion that were the most consequential in our analyses. Parents who found more occasions in daily life to say, sorry, or are you okay, had children who expressed more positive emotion. Now, it would be reasonable to have expected the opposite pattern, that there would be more parent expressions of compassion when children express less positive emotion, because after all, it's sadness or pain that elicit compassion. But that's not what we found. Directing attention to others' distress actually fostered positive emotion in their children. Okay, so words can matter, and compassion words can be particularly important. What are other ways that we can direct attention to emotion in others? What about touch? Well, it turns out that touch amplifies emotion. We looked closely at what was happening as children were spontaneously expressing positive emotion, and we were curious about the role of touching. That touching could certainly be affectionate behaviors like hugs and kisses, but more commonly, it was fairly trivial types of contact, something you might not even notice. a parent wiping hair off of a child's face, leaning into another family member, or hands just touching while passing an object. When we observed, on average, positive emotion expressions, about 1/3 of the time, the child's emotion would continue from one 30-second slice of video to the very next 30-second slice of video. So there would be some sustainment of the child's positive emotion over 30-second slices of the video. However, the odds of that sustainment of positive emotion were significantly enhanced when the family members also just happened to be touching the child. A family member's or a sibling's simple touch appeared to prolong the child's experience and expression of positive emotion. Something as unremarkable as sitting shoulder to shoulder on a couch seemed to help to hold a child's smile a few seconds longer. In the same way that touch has the power to prolong positive emotion, it can also intensify anger. In another analysis of these video, we found that touching, even if it was non-aggressive touching, had an escalating effect on children's anger. So if directing attention through words or through touch can prolong or intensify emotion, what about the opposite? What about withdrawing attention? When we looked at how parents responded to children's expressions of anger, we found that withdrawing parent attention could de-escalate that emotion. Whining was probably the most common anger situation that we recorded in our videos. So it would be something like typical situation, a child complaining about not wanting to finish their homework or not wanting to eat what was being served for dinner. In those moments, parents would sometimes, in fact, often, focus attention on the emotion by criticizing it, or maybe by saying, cut it out. Children generally had negative reactions to those verbal responses. But when parents ignored the whining, that actually reduced the likelihood that it would persist. Ignoring may encourage children to manage their own mild negative emotional states by helping to reduce those states' intensity. I see this particular finding as related to a separate line of work in which I study how people respond to stressors that they encounter outside of the home, not unlike, in some ways, the work that Ben just discussed. One common response on a daily basis to a stressor that one experiences outside of the home, for example, at work, is social withdrawal. Something as mundane as watching television rather than talking can function as a short-term coping response, one that promotes recovery from elevated levels of arousal and negative mood, helping to bring us back to our baseline levels. The point I want to make here is that, yes, people do connect all the time, but sometimes it helps not to connect. Okay, so to sum up here, I'm suggesting that paying attention to a family member's emotions can help to amplify them. And sometimes a temporary withdrawal from interpersonal connections facilitates recovery from emotional arousal. One of the ways that children learn to regulate their emotions, and by that I mean to enhance their positive emotions and tone down their negative emotions, is through experiences like these in the family. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who's here, listening to these presentations, and to some of the key people who were involved in the particular findings that I just discussed. Thank you.
That was terrific, Professor Repetti. And I have a vision of all your coders coding seconds of interactions on these videos. And I know what meticulous work it takes to to produce this kind of fascinating data about findings about families. Okay, if everyone would come on now. We have a lot of questions advanced questions from the audience, and so maybe we can begin with those. So when we think about the development of being social, and this is a very interesting question for somebody who is an introvert or feels like an introvert, like I do. Can being social be developed? Is it a skill that we can develop? Professor Parkinson, maybe you can respond to that.
Sure. Yeah. So to an extent, there do seem to be some stable and even perhaps heritable individual differences in how we go about forging social connections and building our social networks. So, for example, how many different people you tend to connect with, and if you tend to be more of a social bridge or have a tightly knit social circle. But even though we all go about building our social networks in different ways, there's a lot of good evidence that being social more generally can be developed, and that interacting with others is really good for us, not even just for well-being, obviously that's so important, but also for cognitive function like memory. So as I alluded to sort of during my talk, social interactions are really cognitively demanding, right? So even though it often feels effortless and flowing, you have to interpret all these different cues that are coming at you in parallel and plan how you're going to interact, respond, and also predict what the other person's going to do next. And it's been shown recently that maintaining a high level of social engagement can be protective against the development of cognitive impairment that accompanies normal aging. And one study even found that just like a 30-minute video call once a day for about 6 weeks had a really marked improvement on participants' memory and executive functioning. So it seems to be that social engaging with others is good for us in all sorts of ways. And people even seem to be more inclined to adhere to these sorts of interventions, even more so than things that might involve drier seeming cognitive tasks or physical exercise, because for many of us, social interactions feel relatively less challenging and perhaps more engaging. So it does seem to be feasible to promote more social engagement in someone's life, and it seems to be a promising way to promote things like healthy brain aging among its many other benefits.
Thank you. So it sounds like after this session, you and I should take a 30-minute walk, and we get both physical exercise and the social connection, right? Professor Repetti, do you have thoughts on developing being social?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, and I'll speak again about children here. Children can, their social behavior and their tendency to and their ways of socializing with peers or with adults can be shaped by their experiences, and in particular by, in my area of research, I would say by their experiences in their family. But I do think, you know, what Carolyn mentioned at the start of her answer is so important, that there really are individual differences among people and among children in their openness to social interaction, their comfort with social interaction. You described yourself as an introvert. We all know this intuitively, that some of us are more comfortable than others in social situations. So once you start with perhaps those constraints on individuals, what they're born with and what their tendencies are, and then I think through experiences in the family and with peers, that can be shaped, that can be either increased or you can learn to manage your social behavior. I do think some of the research that I was talking about with respect to emotion regulation in children and the development of emotion regulation in children relates to this as well, because being able to regulate your emotions in social situations is so important to the success of your relationships.
Thank you. You know, it does make me think about how are relationships, and this is a question from an audience member, how our relationships have been affected by COVID, which is a very bizarre situation for us socially. And so I wonder, how has COVID affected our relationships? And can we anticipate anything about relationships in the future as a result of having gone through COVID? Professor Karney, maybe you can start.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about it. There's certainly a lot of people who have written first-person narratives in a variety of places. I've read them in the New York Times and all sorts of other places about how COVID has affected the way they interact with the people they live with. And there's been a lot of questions. I've been asked a lot. Is there an overall effect? Has it made our relationships better? Has it made our relationships worse? And consistent with the theme, the answer is undoubtedly different for different people. And you can focus on, we've heard people talk about, well, it depends on what kind of person you are. Some people are comfortable being at home. And so the fact that they had to be at home a lot wasn't quite as challenging as it might have been for someone who really loves to be outside. Another variable, and a variable that I have sort of thought more about, is the conditions of the home in which you were locked down. So the effect of being locked down or told you should stay in your house a lot will be different depending on what's the house like that you're staying in and who are you living with. So for example, for many of us who are privileged, like I'm presenting right now from inside my house, which is a very comfortable place to be. And I have privacy. I have a room to myself where I can talk to you all tonight. So the fact that COVID means that we're not in an auditorium together, but that we're doing this on Zoom, for me is okay. I've got good Wi-Fi, I've got privacy, I've got calm. So it doesn't affect me too badly. I'm very privileged in that way. But there's many, many people in this country who don't have those privileges. Imagine being locked in your home when you don't have very good Wi-Fi. Imagine you're locked in your home when you don't have a lot of privacy, or you share an office, or you don't even have an office. You're doing this at the kitchen table, or you're living in a small place. And who do you live with? Do you live only with your spouse? Do you live with very small children? I'm sure there are people who experienced the last 2 years of COVID with very small children in the house. That's very different than experiencing COVID either alone or experiencing COVID with adult children who you can watch Netflix with, and you'll all watch the same thing. So the quality of the house, the type of people you live with, and of course, then again, there's the quality of the relationship. The fact that we're all spending a lot more time with the people that we live with is great for people who love the people they live with and really enjoy their company. For people who are a little bit irritated by the people they live with, well, this hasn't been such a great experience. So the overall prediction about the effect of COVID and lockdowns on people's relationships is, as in so many things, people who are already privileged are likely to do okay and maybe even enjoy it. People who are already disadvantaged are likely to suffer the most. Unfortunately, that's the way it often is, and that's the way it's likely to be with COVID.
Thank you. Do either of the others of you want to comment on that? How COVID has affected relationships into the future? Dr. Parkinson?
Sure. Yeah, I guess so. On a slightly different note, but also related to the general topic of the question, in some work here at UCLA with Naomi Eisenberger and Razia Sahi and Miriam Schwick, we've been examining some aspects of how social interactions during COVID have evolved and how that has impacted well-being, with the focus on the virtual interactions rather, like we're having at the moment. And one thing that we found is that both the number and the sense of emotional closeness you have to the people that you're interacting with has a pretty large impact on your well-being and your sense of loneliness. So even though it might feel like we're missing a lot when we're restricted to just interacting virtually, and virtual interactions get sort of a bad rap a lot of the time, depending on how one configures those interactions. So if you have virtual interactions with a variety of people, including people who you have a strong bond with, you can extract a significant benefit from them. And I think this is really good to know, and it's a great opportunity to learn about these things as even we look beyond COVID and gradually sort of get back to normal and get used to seeing people in person more of the time again, because there are a lot of people who have limitations on being able to interact with others face to face, irrespective of COVID, maybe because they have mobility limitations or some elderly people who are isolated. And so a lot of the things that we learn about virtual interactions and how best to configure them to extract maximum benefit during COVID, when they're so widespread and we can study them in a powerful way, can hopefully teach us things about how to promote positive outcomes for people even beyond the context of COVID.
Great. Professor Repetti, did you want to comment?
Sure. I think that one of the things that happened during the lockdowns, to the degree that people were no longer working outside of the home, their routines changed. If there were children in the home, their children were then in the home with them, is that it forced everyone to think consciously about who they see, how often they see them, what their social relationships are like. You know, we're used to routines, and we're used to pre-COVID, many of us were used to leaving home to go to work, seeing people at work, then coming back home. We're all in Los Angeles, maybe driving in traffic, coming back home and reuniting with families. There were boundaries and there were routines and there were ebbs and flows. In one of the things that I study, as I alluded to earlier, is stress at work and at home. We were used to being able to change physical contexts and being able to change social contexts every day. And that disappeared. And I think that for many of us, that disappeared during the lockdowns and during COVID. So many people had to think very consciously about how they create boundaries around themselves. And as Ben pointed out, for some people, that's easier than others. If you can go in a room and close a door and be alone, you were very fortunate to be able to do that. Someone else might have to put headphones on and listen to music, or go for a walk in the park, or find a nice day and listen to the birds as you walk to a grocery store. But I think we all had to think very much more consciously about our boundaries, our social boundaries, and our relationships. And I think many people thought much more intentionally about how to connect with others, given that our normal routines were suddenly disrupted. It was an opportunity to think consciously about, I think, relationships, how to maintain relationships, how to keep in touch with people in different ways. And hopefully that will have a lasting effect, that we'll appreciate those relationships, given that we can now hopefully be in touch again.
Right, thank you. And this leads into another question from an audience member, and it is about, are there benefits of not being social? Are there benefits of not connecting? And Rena, I think that you were speaking about, you know, that sometimes not connecting can be beneficial. I'd be interested in all of your thoughts on the sort of the hazards of not connecting, as well as the benefits.
Well, I'll just say that you could go to the extreme of social isolation, which of course is, you know, you mentioned Ted Robles and our colleagues' paper that described it as a public, loneliness as a public health problem. So, you know, extreme social isolation is not something that you want to put yourself in if you can avoid it. But I, as I've already said, I do think some periods of social withdrawal, of some social temporary isolation, to recover emotionally and to not have the stimulation of social interaction is important. And I do think during COVID, it was much more difficult for people to find those opportunities. People who might have been used to maybe a drive home from work or other opportunities to have some sense of changing settings, changing who you're interacting with, giving you a break from that intensity was a problem. And I do think that that's helpful to be able to have that. Looks like Carolyn might have something to add to.
Oh, I didn't have anything specific to add. I was just nodding in agreement and learning from listening to you. I felt like I learned a lot from your talk about some of the benefits of socially disengaging, and you might be best equipped to answer this question.
And what are your thoughts on in terms of couples and disconnecting?
Well, I mean, it raises the question, what does connection even mean? So it's one thing for me to stay away from my partner, but that can often be a way of being responsive. I guess what research on intimacy talks about a lot is the idea of responsiveness being key to feeling connected to somebody. So what makes me connected isn't what you say to me or what I say to you, but it's the exchange of behaviors when I say the right thing in response to what you say. So sometimes the way to be responsive and make you feel like I really understand you is to give you some space, is to back away. So part of being connected to somebody is knowing when to lean in and say, you need a back rub, it's tonight a back rub night. And when to say, guess what? I'm taking the kids. I'm going to bathe everybody. I'm doing the dishes. You're on your own. I can tell you need that. So sort of giving someone a little space in the way that Rena described doesn't mean disconnection. In fact, it can be one of the best ways of showing connection and being responsive to your partner's needs.
Thank you. That leads us into questions we had about how can couples, how can friends, how can families improve their relationships. I'm going to go with Professor Repetti on that one.
Okay.
From your research.
Well, I think that I think some of what Ben just said, I think is really important. Is it has to do with communication and clear communication about needs and being able to read your partner, but also being able to express your desires, what's happening in your life, and what your needs are at the moment are really very important. So I think in terms of improving, I think communication is very important so that you can adjust your behavior to your partner. You need accurate information coming from that partner. So yeah, I mean, there are family therapists and marital therapists who specialize in helping families improve relationships. And I think that for sure that can happen. I do think, I'll just go back to one of the points I was trying to make in the talk. I do think that one of the key ingredients to successful relationships is emotion regulation. So being able to recognize and regulate your own emotional states, whether you're an adult or a child, being able to communicate them accurately to the person that you're in a relationship with, I think is probably some of the most basic foundations of the treatments that have been devised to improve relationships.
I'd like to build on that, because of course I completely agree with Rena that emotion regulation is central. Then it begs another question, which is, why can some people do it, and why is it harder for other people? And that, I think a lot of my work is asking that added question, sort of that next question, that because, like, you know, Rena and I we know that emotion regulation is perfect, and I'm sure Rena is always perfect at doing it. I myself sometimes am not perfect. So I say, in addition to trying to be the best we can be, is acknowledging that not everything's in our control. And actually, there's real good research that if we're aware of the sort of outside and invisible forces that impact our relationship and our ability to emotion regulate, we're at an advantage. So it's one thing to say, you know, I'm going to regulate my emotions. It's another thing, and also very hard, to say, I don't have it tonight. It's been a terrible day, and I've had to give, you know, some bad news to people, So tonight, I'm not going to be my best self. The even harder thing is to do that for our partners. Is to do it for our partners when they can't do it, when they can't say it for themselves, is to see what they may not see. Like, oh, you're not in a great mood. It's not because you're a pill. It's not because you don't love me. It's not because you're just irritable, but I know you've had a bad day and I'm going to cut you some slack. That's the way I can love you tonight, by cutting you some slack, by seeing the forces outside the house. We have to look for them. It's not always easy to see them. You know, I see my partner. I don't see the bad day you had 3 hours ago, but that is a gift we can give our partners by being aware.
Yeah, I agree, Ben. And sometimes the stressors are common to everyone. Like if you're talking about a couple or you're talking about a family, that one of the basic points you made in your talk was the common stressors that everyone in the family is exposed to. Sometimes it's, the couple is exposed to a sick family member or a child who's having a very difficult time or struggling. Those are common stressors, and that just compounds that problem that you're describing. I'm sorry, Carolyn, I think you were about to say something. I may cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just going to add that I guess something else that we find in our research that's associated with both objective social connection, so forging friendships and having lots of social partners, and also your subjective sense of being socially connected with others, is sort of the sense of having common understanding with people and having some common ground with them. And during COVID, a lot of us had less choice with respect to who we were surrounded by, whether it's a roommate or a sibling or something like that, who might not necessarily always elect to be around 24/7 if the circumstances were different. But there's some research suggesting that by finding and really emphasizing common ground with the people who you're with, even if you do disagree about lots of things, that can help to reinforce your relationships with your friends, and also on an individual level, help you to feel more socially connected with others and less lonely.
Thank you. Finding common ground. I think that that's something that we can all take away from this. And our time is just about up. And so I hope everyone has enjoyed this. We've had well over 300 people on tonight, and so we are quite a big collective. And we are going to send you a post-event email with a link to the recording, and so please share it widely. I always learn something from these events, and I am so thankful to all of you for sharing your research with us tonight, and to everyone who tuned in. Please have a good evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.